I used to own the nights in Brooklyn, weaving through New York's gritty streets like a phantom, carrying a message that grace can reach even the hardest hearts.
I thought I was untouchable, a king in a concrete jungle.
The city's pulse was my heartbeat. Fast cash, high stakes. How I traded the streets for a pulpit.
Growing up in East New York, Brooklyn, during the 1980s meant navigating a landscape where survival often trumped morality. The neighborhood, scarred by urban decay and the crack epidemic, was a far cry from the American dream promised in television commercials and political speeches. For Marcus Johnson, a pseudonym for our Reform Street hustler, these streets were both classroom and battlefield, teaching lessons that no traditional education could provide. The culture of the streets in Brooklyn during this era was defined by unwritten rules and fierce loyalty. Corner bodegas served as community centers where information flowed as freely as the Budweiser and Newport cigarettes. The Dominican barbers on Pitkin Avenue weren't just cutting hair. They were dispensing wisdom, settling disputes, and serving as informal counselors for young men who had few positive role models. This was American urban culture at its rawest, a blend of Caribbean, African American, and Latino influences creating a unique ecosystem of survival. Marcus learned early that respect was currency, and fear was often the fastest way to earn it. The basketball courts at Betsy Head Park became his stage, where street ball wasn't just recreation but a proving ground for young men seeking identity and recognition. The chain-link fences bore witness to dreams deferred and potential wasted, as talented athletes turned to quicker money on the streets rather than pursuing scholarships that seemed as distant as the Manhattan skyline. The crack epidemic had transformed American inner cities into war zones, and Brooklyn was no exception. Mothers would lock their children inside apartments that felt more like prisons than homes, while fathers either disappeared into the criminal justice system or simply vanished altogether. This absence of positive male figures created a void that street mentors, often older criminals, were eager to fill. For Marcus, these men became surrogate fathers, teaching him the economics of the underground economy with the same patience that suburban parents might use to explain baseball statistics. American consumer culture penetrated even these forgotten neighborhoods through the golden arches of McDonald's and the bright lights of check-cashing stores that lined Atlantic Avenue. The irony wasn't lost on residents. They were simultaneously part of and excluded from the American economic system. They could buy the same sneakers and fast food as their suburban counterparts, but legitimate paths to prosperity seemed deliberately obscured. The music that echoed from boom boxes and car stereos told their stories better than any sociologist could. Hip-hop was born in neighborhoods like this, giving voice to experiences that mainstream America preferred to ignore. Run DMC, LL Cool J, and later Notorious B.I.G. became prophets of the streets, their lyrics serving as both celebration and condemnation of urban American life. For young men like Marcus, these artists proved that their stories mattered, that their struggles were worthy of attention. Church was present in the neighborhood, storefront Baptist churches, Catholic parishes with Spanish masses, and the occasional mosque. But for many young men caught in the street life, these institutions seemed irrelevant to their daily reality. The God preached from these pulpits appeared disconnected from the God who might help you survive a drug deal gone wrong or navigate the complex politics of gang affiliation. This spiritual disconnect would later become crucial to Marcus's transformation, but at the time, faith seemed like a luxury he couldn't afford. The educational system, underfunded and overwhelmed, often served more as a pipeline to prison than a pathway to opportunity. Teachers, many of whom commuted from safer neighborhoods, struggled to connect with students whose home lives included responsibilities that children should never bear. Marcus would later reflect that his real education happened in the streets, learning to read people, understanding economics through drug transactions, and developing survival instincts that served him well even after he left that life behind. Family structures in the neighborhood were complex and fluid. Biological fathers might be absent, but stepfathers, uncles, older brothers, and family friends could provide stability and guidance. Mothers often worked multiple jobs, their absence creating opportunities for street influences to take hold. The concept of family extended beyond blood relations to include crew members and neighborhood associates who would risk their lives for each other. This was the America that existed parallel to suburban shopping malls and corporate boardrooms, an America where the rules were different but the dreams were often the same. Young men in East New York wanted respect, financial security, and the ability to provide for their families, just like their counterparts in more prosperous neighborhoods. The difference lay in the available methods for achieving these goals and the consequences of the choices they made. The transformation from this environment to the pulpit represents one of the most dramatic reversals possible in American society, from criminality to moral leadership, from taking from the community to giving back, from spreading harm to offering healing. Understanding where the journey began makes the destination all the more remarkable. The transition from occasional street corner sales to full-time hustling happened gradually, like many young men in urban America during the late 1980s and early 1990s. Marcus's initiation into the drug trade wasn't dramatic. No cinematic moment of crossing a line. Instead, it was a series of small compromises, each one making the next seem less significant. This progression reflects a broader American narrative about how economic desperation can gradually erode moral boundaries. The drug trade in Brooklyn operated like a corporate structure, complete with hierarchy, territories, and unwritten policies. At the bottom were the runners, usually young teenagers who carried drugs and money, their youth providing some protection from serious criminal charges. Above them were the corner workers, responsible for direct sales and customer relations. The lieutenants managed territories and resolved conflicts, while the suppliers controlled inventory and distribution. At the top sat the kingpins, often invisible figures who treated drug dealing like any other American business venture, complete with supply chain management and profit maximization strategies. Marcus started as a runner for a crew operating near the intersection of Liberty and Pennsylvania Avenues, an area that had once been a thriving commercial district but had deteriorated as businesses fled to safer locations. The irony of selling drugs on Liberty Avenue wasn't lost on him. This was American liberty in its most perverse form, the freedom to choose between poverty and criminality when legitimate opportunities seemed non-existent. The culture of the streets had its own language, dress codes, and social norms. Starter jackets, gold chains, and the latest sneakers weren't just fashion statements but indicators of success and status. The ability to dress fly demonstrated that you were making money, which in turn provided protection and respect. This materialistic aspect of street culture mirrored mainstream American values, just expressed through different means. The same consumer desires that drove suburban Americans to work overtime for luxury cars motivated young hustlers to risk their freedom for designer clothing. Technology played a crucial role in the evolution of street-level drug operations. Pagers became essential tools, allowing dealers to manage customers and coordinate with suppliers while maintaining some distance from direct transactions. Payphones served as mobile offices, with certain locations becoming informal headquarters for different crews. The introduction of cellular phones in the 1990s revolutionized the business, making operations more efficient but also easier for law enforcement to monitor. The customers represented a cross-section of American society that challenged stereotypes about drug use. While media portrayals focused on inner-city addicts, Marcus served teachers, construction workers, nurses, and office workers who commuted from the suburbs to purchase drugs. This customer base revealed the widespread nature of drug use in American society and the hypocrisy of a war on drugs that criminalized users in poor neighborhoods while treating addiction in wealthy areas as a medical issue. Violence was an ever-present reality, but it was often more strategic than random. Reputation for violence could prevent conflicts by deterring competitors and maintaining order within territories. The gun culture that pervaded the streets reflected broader American attitudes toward firearms, but with higher stakes and fewer legal protections. For young men like Marcus, carrying a weapon was seen as a necessary evil rather than a desire to cause harm. The relationship between street dealers and law enforcement was complex and often contradictory. Beat cops might look the other way for small-scale operations while focusing on bigger targets, creating an informal understanding that allowed business to continue with minimal interference. This selective enforcement reflected the broader American approach to drug policy, tough rhetoric combined with pragmatic accommodation of realities on the ground. Family relationships became strained as Marcus's involvement in street life deepened. His mother, a home health aide who worked double shifts to make ends meet, watched helplessly as her son became increasingly distant and secretive. The money he contributed to household expenses created a moral dilemma. She knew where it came from but couldn't deny that it helped pay bills that her legitimate income couldn't cover. This tension between moral principles and economic necessity reflected struggles faced by many American families in similar circumstances. The neighborhood itself became transformed by the drug trade. Buildings that had once housed thriving businesses became crack houses and shooting galleries. Parks where children had played became open-air drug markets. The social fabric of the community, already weakened by decades of disinvestment and neglect, was further damaged by the violence and chaos that accompanied the illegal drug economy. Despite the dangers and moral compromises, The drug trade provided something that legitimate employment in the neighborhood couldn't: immediate access to the American dream. Young men who had been written off by schools and ignored by employers could suddenly afford the luxury items that television commercials insisted were necessary for happiness and respect. This achievement of material success through illegal means created a powerful narrative that competed with traditional messages about hard work and delayed gratification. The psychological impact of living this double life: successful businessman by his own standards, criminal by society's definition, created internal conflicts that Marcus didn't fully understand at the time. The constant stress of avoiding arrest, managing violent conflicts, and maintaining relationships with family members who disapproved of his lifestyle took a toll that wouldn't become apparent until years later, when he began the process of rebuilding his life on different principles. The American criminal justice system revealed its true nature to Marcus during his 18-month incarceration at Rikers Island, beginning in 2001. What started as a routine drug possession charge escalated when prosecutors decided to make an example of him, seeking enhanced penalties based on his previous arrests. The transition from the streets of Brooklyn to the concrete corridors of one of America's most notorious jail complexes represented more than just a change of scenery. It was a journey into the underbelly of American society, where the promises of justice and rehabilitation collided with the realities of punishment and warehousing. Rikers Island sits in the East River between Queens and the Bronx, a 400-acre facility that has processed millions of Americans through its gates since opening in 1932. For Marcus, arriving there in shackles represented the culmination of choices that had seemed logical in the moment but devastating in retrospect. The intake process stripped away not just his clothing but his identity. He became a number in a system designed more for control than correction. This dehumanization reflected broader American attitudes toward criminal justice, where punishment often took precedence over rehabilitation or understanding root causes of criminal behavior. The demographics of Rikers told the story of American inequality in stark statistical terms. The vast majority of inmates were Black and Latino men from neighborhoods similar to Marcus's own, while the guards and administrators were predominantly white and commuted from suburban communities. This racial divide created an atmosphere of us versus them that permeated every interaction and reinforced the social divisions that existed in the broader society. For Marcus, this dynamic forced him to confront how his own choices had contributed to negative stereotypes about young Black men in America. Daily life in jail was governed by unwritten rules and informal hierarchies that mirrored but also contradicted the social structures Marcus had known on the streets. Respect was still important, but the parameters for earning and maintaining it were different. Educational achievement, which had meant little in the drug trade, suddenly carried weight among inmates who recognized that knowledge might be their only pathway to avoiding future incarceration. This revelation began Marcus's reassessment of values he had rejected during his youth. The commissary system at Rikers provided a microcosm of American consumer culture within the constraints of incarceration. Inmates with money could purchase snacks, toiletries, and other small luxuries that made jail life more bearable, while those without resources struggled with basic necessities. This economic stratification continued even behind bars, demonstrating how class differences persisted regardless of circumstances. For Marcus, who had grown accustomed to having money for whatever he needed, the limitations imposed by the commissary system forced him to reconsider his relationship with material possessions. Television programming in the common areas offered glimpses of the outside world that both entertained and tormented inmates. Watching sitcoms about suburban families, news reports about economic prosperity, and advertisements for products they couldn't afford created a sense of disconnection from mainstream American society. For Marcus, these programs served as reminders of the life Keisha had wanted for their family and highlighted the gap between his choices and their consequences. The mail system became a lifeline to the outside world, but also a source of pain as Marcus watched his relationships deteriorate from a distance. Letters from Keisha grew shorter and less frequent, reflecting her struggle to maintain emotional connection with someone whose incarceration had disrupted their family's stability. His children's drawings and school reports, sent by his mother, provided motivation but also guilt about his absence during crucial years of their development. The American Postal Service, a symbol of connection and communication, became a daily reminder of what he was losing through his incarceration. Religious programming at Rikers was run by volunteers from various faith communities throughout New York City, representing the diversity of American religious experience. Muslims, Christians, Jews, and others offered services, classes, and counseling to inmates seeking spiritual guidance. For Marcus, who had maintained a nominal belief in God while living a lifestyle that contradicted Christian teachings, These programs provided his first serious exposure to theology and moral philosophy since childhood Sunday school classes. The turning point came during a particularly low period when Marcus received news that Keisha was filing for divorce and seeking full custody of their children. Sitting in his cell, contemplating the destruction of everything he had claimed to value, he found himself genuinely praying for the first time since childhood. This wasn't the desperate bargaining that often accompanied court dates or dangerous situations on the streets, but a sincere admission of failure and a request for guidance about how to rebuild his life on different principles. Pastor Williams, a volunteer chaplain from a Pentecostal church in Queens, became Marcus's spiritual mentor during the final months of his incarceration. A former drug addict himself, Pastor Williams understood the challenges facing men trying to transition from street life to legitimate existence. Their weekly conversations combined practical advice about finding employment and housing with deeper discussions about forgiveness, redemption, and the possibility of transformation. This mentorship relationship reflected the best aspects of American volunteerism and community support. The prison library became Marcus's classroom for a different kind of education. Books about African American history, Christian theology, and personal development replaced the street knowledge that had guided his previous decisions. Reading about leaders like Malcolm X, who had undergone his own transformation while incarcerated, provided hope that change was possible even for someone with his background. The American tradition of self-improvement through education, which he had rejected during his youth, suddenly seemed relevant to his circumstances. Preparation for release involved more than just serving time. It required developing a plan for reintegration into society that wouldn't lead back to criminal activity. The reentry programs available at Rikers were limited, reflecting broader shortcomings in American criminal justice policy. Most inmates left prison with little preparation for the challenges they would face in finding housing, employment, and rebuilding family relationships. For Marcus, this reality meant taking responsibility for his own transformation rather than relying on institutional support. The spiritual awakening that began during his incarceration wasn't a dramatic, movie-like conversion but a gradual recognition that his previous values and priorities had led to destruction rather than fulfillment. The materialism and status-seeking that had driven his involvement in drug dealing were replaced by a growing understanding that meaning came from service to others rather than personal accumulation. This shift in perspective would become the foundation for his eventual transformation from street hustler to community leader. The release from Rikers Island in late 2002 marked the beginning of Marcus's most challenging period. Not the dramatic moment of freedom portrayed in movies, but a gradual, often frustrating process of rebuilding a life without the shortcuts and quick fixes that had previously defined his approach to problems. American society's treatment of formerly incarcerated individuals created obstacles that tested his newfound faith daily, from employment applications that automatically disqualified felons to landlords who refused to rent to people with criminal records. This systematic exclusion from mainstream economic opportunities had driven many of his former associates back to illegal activities, but Marcus was determined to chart a different course. The transition began at a halfway house in Brownsville, Brooklyn, one of the most impoverished neighborhoods in New York City. The facility, run by a faith-based organization, provided temporary housing for men transitioning from prison back to civilian life. The rules were strict: curfews, mandatory job searches, regular drug testing, and participation in counseling sessions. But they provided structure that helped residents develop new routines and habits. For Marcus, this environment served as a bridge between the regimented world of incarceration and the freedom that awaited those who successfully completed the program. Finding legitimate employment proved more challenging than he had anticipated. The booming economy of the late 1990s had given way to recession following the September 11th attacks, and competition for entry-level positions was fierce. His criminal record eliminated him from consideration for many jobs, while his lack of formal work experience in legitimate fields made him an unattractive candidate for others. After weeks of rejection, he found work with a moving company owned by a church member who believed in second chances. The physical labor was hard, and the pay was a fraction of what he had earned selling drugs, but it provided the dignity that came with honest work. Rebuilding his relationship with his children required patience and consistency that contrasted sharply with his previous lifestyle. Keisha, now remarried to a social worker and living in New Jersey, was understandably protective of Marcus Jr. and Destiny, allowing only supervised visits initially. Watching his son play Little League Baseball from behind a chain-link fence, Marcus realized how much he had missed during their crucial developmental years. American youth sports culture, with its emphasis on parental involvement and community support, highlighted his absence and motivated him to become the kind of father his children deserved. The church became central to Marcus's transformation, not just as a source of spiritual guidance but as a community that provided practical support and accountability. Mount Calvary Baptist Church in Bedford-Stuyvesant welcomed him despite his past, embodying the Christian principle of redemption that had become theoretical during his street years. Pastor Thompson, a second-generation minister whose own father had built the congregation during the civil rights era, became both mentor and father figure, helping Marcus understand how faith could be lived out in daily choices rather than reserved for Sunday mornings. Educational opportunities that Marcus had dismissed during his youth suddenly became relevant to his goals. He enrolled in evening classes at Medgar Evers College, the same institution where Keisha had studied nursing years earlier. Returning to school at age 32 meant competing with students young enough to be his siblings, but it also provided him with knowledge and credentials necessary for advancement in legitimate careers. His criminology classes were particularly meaningful, as they helped him understand the systemic factors that had shaped his neighborhood and choices, while also preparing him for future work with at-risk youth. The American prison system's impact on families became personal as Marcus worked to rebuild trust with his children and win back their respect. His son, now 13, had internalized his mother's protective attitudes and was initially resistant to developing a relationship with his father. American popular culture's portrayal of absent fathers provided few positive models for this reconciliation process, forcing Marcus to develop his own approach based on consistency, honesty, and patience. Slowly, through regular visits, attendance at school events and genuine interest in their lives, he began to earn back their trust. Housing stability remained a constant challenge, as landlords continued to discriminate against applicants with criminal records despite fair housing laws that supposedly prohibited such practices. Marcus eventually found an apartment in East New York, not far from where he had grown up, but the neighborhood had continued to deteriorate during his absence. The return to his old stomping grounds tested his commitment to change, as former associates offered easy money and familiar comfort, while new residents viewed him with suspicion because of his criminal history. Community involvement became both a source of purpose and a pathway to respectability. Marcus volunteered with youth programs at his church, sharing his story with teenagers who faced similar choices to those he had confronted years earlier. These interactions revealed the ongoing challenges facing young people in urban America: underfunded schools, limited economic opportunities, and the persistent allure of street life. His authenticity, born from personal experience rather than academic theory, resonated with youth who had learned to dismiss traditional authority figures. The calling to ministry emerged gradually through these volunteer experiences and deepening spiritual study. Marcus recognized that his background, rather than disqualifying him from religious leadership, actually enhanced his ability to connect with people who felt disconnected from traditional churches. American Protestant traditions offered various pathways to ordination, and he chose to pursue credentials through a denomination that valued personal transformation over formal theological education, though he continued his academic studies as well. Starting a storefront church in the same neighborhood where he had once sold drugs represented the ultimate transformation of his life's purpose. New Hope Community Church began with 12 members meeting in a rented space that had previously housed a check-cashing business. The symbolism wasn't lost on Marcus, transforming a place that had exploited the community's economic desperation into a source of spiritual hope and practical support. American religious freedom allowed him to create a worship experience that combined traditional Baptist theology with contemporary music and culturally relevant preaching. Marriage restoration required even more patience than rebuilding relationships with his children. Keisha's remarriage had provided her with the stability she had sought during their turbulent years together, but Marcus's genuine transformation over several years slowly convinced her that he had truly changed. Their remarriage in 2008 represented not just personal victory but a testimony to the possibility of redemption and second chances that resonated throughout their community. The ceremony, held at his church, was attended by former inmates, current members of his congregation, and family members who had watched his journey from the streets to the pulpit. The success of New Hope Community Church reflected both Marcus's personal credibility and the community's hunger for authentic leadership. Within 5 years, the congregation had grown to over 200 members, many of whom were formerly incarcerated individuals, recovering addicts, and families affected by various forms of trauma. The church's programs expanded to include job training, financial literacy classes, and youth mentorship, addressing the practical needs that traditional churches sometimes overlooked while maintaining a focus on spiritual transformation. This journey from street hustler to community leader embodied essential elements of American culture. the belief in second chances, the possibility of reinvention, and the power of faith to transform lives. Marcus's story demonstrated that redemption was possible even for those who had made terrible choices, but it also highlighted the systemic challenges that made such transformations difficult. His success wasn't just personal but served as proof that individuals could overcome their circumstances and become agents of positive change in their communities, representing the best of American ideals about personal responsibility and community uplift.